Namaste. Welcome to Speaking of Craft with Khem. In this podcast, I invite authors, mainly the contributors to my forthcoming anthology, Migrating Craft, scheduled for release in 2026, to talk about their writing and craft. I'm Khem K, Aryal, a writer and editor. My guest for this new episode is an incredibly lucid poet and novelist, Bunkong Tuon. Hi, Bunkong.
Hi there, Kim. How are you?
I'm good, wonderful. Bunkong Tuon is a Cambodian American writer, postcard winning poet, and professor at Union College in New York. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in Michigan Quarterly Review, World Literature Today, Copper Nickel, New York Quarterly, Massachusetts Review, and Verse Daily, among others. He is the author of several poetry collections, including What Is Left, which came out, I guess, in 2024.
Yep.
And he's also the author of a novel called Khem, which also came out in 2024 from Northeastern University Press, Cobblestone Books. He's poetry editor of Cultural Daily. Thanks for joining me. It's so wonderful to be speaking with you. I'm excited about your writing and to talk about your writing and craft.
It's a pleasure being here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah.
For inviting me to be a part of this, and also a part of your anthology, which sounds really, really exciting. For doing really, really good work. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely. Let me start with this. Ghosts appear so much in your writing, in your poems, and in your novel as well. In your collection, Gruel, the first poem itself has some reference to ghosts, and your latest collection, What Is Left, in this collection, I think the title poem itself has ghosts. So let me actually read out the last section of this poem in which ghosts appear. Your first poem in Gruel, the title is The House of Many Voices. So you end this poem like this. There are many ghosts here. Listen. I was caught by one of these ghosts the other day. And I'm telling you this, passing it on to you, not in some spirit of generosity, but so that I can be free. So, why are ghosts so important to you? And how can those ghosts make you free?
I'm a child survivor of the Cambodian genocide, and I grew up in America. But there's a bit of guilt in terms of my own survival, and I felt like it just sort of felt like the pressure of history, especially with regards to the Cambodian genocide and the victims, those who didn't make it. So for me, especially with the earlier sort of books, a kind of haunting sort of takes place when it comes to writing these poems and these stories. Sort of the voices, the spirits of those who didn't make it. So I always feel that, especially very early on. So writing for me is a kind of exorcism where I try my best to honor the memories of the victims and create a space for them so that they could be heard, so that their stories could be understood, and that's really a crucial part of my writing. The other part has to do with sort of a kind of unburdening some of the things that I carry with me. So writing as a way of came out of grieving and loss and hurt, but it's a way for me to kind of an attempt to heal. I don't think that writing will help me completely heal, but it has helped me unburden some of the heavy load. So I'm so glad that you are doing very good, diligent work in terms of examining the earlier works as well as the new, uh, you know, collection and the new novel. But ghosts are a big part of why I wrote, why I began my writing, and I think it still is too. Um, and in terms of the novel, um, in our culture, do you remember that chapter called Lokta, where the grandfather is explaining to Samnang about how the American world seemed to be empty of spirituality, empty of the world of spirits, um, but the world in terms of the Cambodian culture, um, spirits are everywhere, ghosts are everywhere. So I really wanted to convey that world view, that sense of this spiritual world exists alongside this world, this material world. So there's, in terms of the novel, it's a little bit different, but in terms of the poetry, especially the earlier sort of um, the earlier sort of part of my writing, the heavy burden of history
Right.
and a bit of the guilt of survival, and attempt to write and honor. My mother, didn't make it.
Right.
She didn't survive. So there are poems where I wrote about her,
Right.
and that's a big part of, in terms of why ghosts been really crucial, part of my writing. Um, I hope that sort of answers some.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I was also thinking in terms of, again, it's a little different context. In your case, you came here as a refugee. You moved from Cambodia to Thailand and then to Indonesia and then America. But I'm thinking about any immigrant, even if they didn't have to suffer the way you suffered, for example. In some cases, they might be just coming here in search of better opportunities. But the idea of the ghost always lingers, right? You cannot get rid of the ghosts that you carry with you as an immigrant. In your case, is okay, those who could not make it, who you've lost.
Hmm.
In other cases, could be something like, okay, that life was probably better, or those family members who've been left behind. So the idea of ghost, right? That's always present, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Like you said, it doesn't have to be sort of the story of the refugee and victims of genocides or war, but the idea of leaving home
Right.
and leaving the people and the culture and the homeland, and sort of set up families here. And yet that other world that you leave behind, they're still there.
Right.
But so it's sort of a kind of absent present in our minds, in the refugees' mind, immigrants' mind, and I think the most interesting part is sort of learning how to be in the new adopted land, but also hold on to that in a way that is not in conflict. Um,
Right. Right.
that's sort of the art of surviving and living a healthy, sort of good life, at least from my perspective, in terms of.
Yeah, I agree with you, right? It's not about getting rid of those ghosts or just living with those ghosts. I guess it's about how we make sense of all those experiences, those ghosts, and
Uh-huh. And
live in the
integrate that
present,
to
right?
to your life, yeah. Have that be a part of you,
Right.
and not to be ashamed or embarrassed, but to integrate it as part of your identity. And if you have children, you like to kind of pass it down in a way that is healthy
Right.
for your children to inherit the quote unquote ghosts, the traditions and cultures of your people,
Right.
of your ancestors.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, now this kind of leads me to another question. So could you tell me something about your literary upbringing? I think you had to leave Cambodia when you were around 8 or 9 years old.
Yeah. You know, in terms of literary upbringing, is very American.
Oh, right.
Um, in the camp, I really didn't go to school. I was taught by my grandfather the alphabet, the Khmer alphabet, and I was learning how to read and and write, but more like first, second grade level. Um, for me, it was moving to Long Beach, California. Was where I had this kind of rebirth, and it was the Long Beach Poetry School. Discovering Charles Bukowski in a library, the Dana Public Library in Long Beach, and reading his work. It was very accessible, and I could actually understand what was being conveyed. And from there, I went to school. I went back to school, and I took classes with Gerald Laughlin, who was a poet and professor at Cal State Long Beach.
So quickly, sorry to interrupt. So you went to school after you discovered Charles Bukowski. That's what you are saying?
That's correct.
Oh,
That's
oh,
correct. I
that's
was I
interesting.
was uh, I was a college dropout,
Okay.
and I worked at odd jobs. The most sort of memorable, I was a janitor, a night sort of graveyard ship night janitor. Um, but I did discover the work of Charles Bukowski, and from there I discovered other writers and artists. And then I felt like I needed to learn how to write. So I went back to school and immersed myself in English literature classes. And Gerald Laughlin was a poet at Cal State Long Beach, and I learned quite a lot from him. Marilyn Johnson was a poet and writer. She was the co-founder of Pearl magazine, and I learned quite a bit from her. And then, from there, we're talking about Larry's sort of upbringing and education. I was introduced to uh, American writers like Raymond Carver,
Right.
and then later on, Tobias Wolff. So, sort of my upbringing is American, minimalist, and very clear and accessible. But at the same time, I took a class with Professor Roberta Markman, who introduced me to world literature. And I was very much like awakened by the intensity and the psychological intensity of Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov and Tolstoy and all that stuff. So there's a little bit of kind of international with the Russian, with the French in terms of Albert Camus, and all that stuff. But I think mainly American with a bit of international Russian and French influence. So that's sort of my kind of upbringing. I think now I have like two major sort of writers that I admire because I've taught them so many times. Uh, Tim O'Brien, the Vietnam veteran. Uh,
Right.
I teach a class on discourses on the Vietnam/American War. And for me, when it comes to O'Brien, is the idea of clarity and accessibility, where readers could really relate to the experiences of the characters, in this case, the soldiers. And I like that a lot. O'Brien said, I want you to feel what I feel. That kind of sort of connection. And the other writer is Toni Morrison. I teach a seminar on Morrison, and the book Going Khmer is a little bit influenced by Morrison, especially her work Song of Solomon, and that has to do with lots of ghosts and spirits in that book. When you read something like that, you think, I think I could do it too, or at least I think I could try. So my style is a lot like O'Brien, but in terms of the worldview, in terms of the spirituality, in terms of the sense of community and people and culture, it's Toni Morrison and her world. But you might not see it in Going Khmer, but I'm telling you that those two authors, as you know, as a teacher at Union College, I've taught them so many times, their work so many times that they're become a part of me. And the reason I teach them so many times because I like them. I adore their work.
Right,
You
right,
know, so for me, the upbringing is sort of Long Beach poetry scene, writing scene, and then later on, international in terms of the Russians and the French, and then now is very much Morrison and O'Brien. Those two are still up there for me.
right. Uh, I think it's in your novel as you talk about, see, your formation as, and we'll talk about the novel a little bit more later.
Yep.
But one of the references there is to Dostoevsky and even Buddha. What I found really interesting in this context is you brought these two together, Buddha and Dostoevsky, as you talk about the depiction of suffering. Would you like to say something about that?
Uh, yeah, I haven't thought about much about that. I'm glad you picked that up. I think the character Samnang was really trying to find a way to help with his suffering, a way to deal with suffering, and that's sort of the teaching of the Buddha.
Right,
The first noble truth is like life is suffering, and then there are different ways, different steps, and the
right,
fourth noble truth is talking about the different steps that you can take, about to to avoid the cycle of suffering. Um,
right,
and I think Samnang was sort of trying to find uh, sort of answers to his pain and his suffering. So he looked for those answers in books, in the works of Dostoevsky. For Dostoevsky, I have to go back and reread some of these sections because it's been a while. But the idea is that, there's a sort of the psychological sort of turmoil of one's mind.
right.
That's a really good question. That's sort of
Now, I found that intriguing, especially because, of course, Buddha coming from this tradition, right? Dostoevsky writing in Russia, and of course, the idea of suffering and how you approach suffering, the region, right there that there is,
yeah.
and in some cases, like all of us come with some sort of suffering. How much of that is justified? How much of that is not justified?
Hmm.
Unfair, right? So
Yeah.
those questions I found pretty interesting as I was going through that particular section in the book. Anyway, I just thought
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah. That's a great question. You're absolutely right. And it has to do with suffering. It has to do with there's some kind of suffering that you can control, and others, in the case of Sanan, uh, beyond his control.
right.
In terms of how others treat him because of his, racial otherness,
Right.
because of his poverty.
Yeah.
Uh, but he has to learn. He has to learn. And I think he he seeks some sort of deep answers in literature. And I think the book is a kind of homage to the power of literature and writing and storytelling.
Yeah, it is. I agree. Yeah, definitely. And you named this last section, the portrait of an artist as a young man kind of thing, right? Echo,
Yeah,
making an
James
artist,
Joyce Echo. Yeah.
right? Something
Yep.
like that. Yeah. A little bit more about, again, your poems, the influences, because I found them interesting also because, like you mentioned, um, Charles Bukowski, of course.
Hmm.
But in terms of, uh, I don't know, real influence, for instance, the accessibility, and in Bukowski's case, probably the lack of metaphors, but the details, right? Just the
Hmm.
anecdotes, how revealing those anecdotes are, even without an excessive use of metaphors and those kinds of things, right?
Hmm.
Um, and in your case, of course, I can see so many metaphors, so many images, ghosts, of course, as we mentioned before.
Hmm.
So,
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, I think inspiration at the very beginning, but also, that first book grew. I think is a book of Long Beach poetry book. just because it's such a narrative book. It's the book of narrative poetry with, as you said, with, with, with not a lot of literary sort of techniques in terms of imagery and metaphor. I mean, there are some, but most of the poems are pretty narrative poetry. And in that sense, not only was I inspired by Bukowski, but I was also influenced by his sort of aesthetics. But if you look at the book, you know, um, What is Lost, in some of my recent writing, there is a very careful sense of craft and in terms of imagery and metaphor and control that is a little different from that first book that was published in 2015
Right.
by NYQ Books. So the point is, I think, is that writers, we grow, we
Yeah.
change,
Yeah.
and for me now is sort of I it takes much longer for me to write a poem that I like. And I'm much more sort of selective and careful in terms of places that I send my work to. So now there's sort of, because of I've grown as a writer from reading and from teaching students, who also have taught me how to write and read, that there is growth. And when there's growth, you can see the shift and change. And, you know, I'm, I think the subject matters are similar, but the aesthetics and styles are a little different from when I began as a writer. And I began pretty early on, like in the 1990s. And I stopped writing poetry and stories when I was in grad school because I was trained as a critic. I wasn't going for the MFA. I was going for the MA/PhD in
Right.
comparative literature. So I kept all that writing behind. I just
Right.
put it in the closet and I'm not going to think about it. And when I got a job at Union in 2008, I believe, I had to do what I had to do to get tenure, which is to write, peer review articles and book chapters. And I did that.
Right.
Now, once I got that out of the way, then I went back to the writing. I mean, the writing is always there.
Right.
So that book first grew, that first book grew was sort of was me going back to writing, and the first thing to do was to go back to the Long Beach Poetry sort of school, and kind of remind myself that this is where I began. And as the book, as I continue to publish, I've changed and I've grown, and I'm happy with the growth and the change. Because that's what you're supposed to do. You want to challenge yourself. You don't want to write the same
Yeah, that's true.
poems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing we can see is the uh, recurrence of certain images. For example, this tamarind tree appearing in the first book, and of course you have that in your novel, and you talk about that in um, different contexts. So I was just wondering, um, does it have to do anything with the circular nature of trauma writing or something like that?
You know, themes of and images of hunger and starvations and the Khmer Rouge and food, tamarind tree, um, ghosts. Um, they are sort of images and themes that are part of my constellation as a writer. And I don't sort of look for them. They're just a part of who I am and my world. And the idea is that, especially for those who survive like genocide and experience PTSD, like we go back to these scenes of pain and difficulty and trauma, and kind of because I don't know if we, as I said, I don't know if we can actually recover and ultimately heal, but we go back to them, and we can't help it. It's just that's it. That's it just goes back there automatically. Um, and you kind of work through it, again, and then think you're done, and you go back and you start writing, and the thing come back again. And I don't like it's not conscious.
Right.
It's just part of the constellation of my psyche and my experiences, and and I've learned, I think we do the same thing. It doesn't have to be, writers who experience trauma. But it's, going back to Raymond Carver, there's this idea that, you notice immediately that, this is my work in terms of just the images and the metaphors and themes and the voices, all.
Right.
And Kama talked about it, this indistinguishable sort of voice that is yours. And that's just who I am. But I think trauma is a part of it too, in terms of that kind of world. Anyway, yeah, that's real good, real good. These are really good questions to get me to think about my own work a bit more. Um, so very, very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, see, writing about those experiences, those painful experiences, going back to them again and again. Uh, so that's what you've been doing.
Hmm.
And one thing kind of struck me, and maybe I can say this, I keep thinking about in terms of how we write about our experiences is we're using the language that's not our own. And you've said actually about under the tamarind tree this that this poem would be unrecognizable in the Cambodian literary tradition.
Yeah.
So how do you look at this issue?
I think it has to do with our hybrid self. Uh, we are in America, and in my case, you know, English is the language that I have more control of.
Right.
And of course, I've talked about my literary background and education, right? But the stories and the cultures and the voices and the traditions and the sense of ghosts, and that's Khmer, that's Cambodian.
Right.
Uh, Buddhist beliefs and teachings, Khmer sayings, that's another part of my identity. And I identify myself as a 1.5 generation Khmer American, meaning that I came here uh, not as an adult and not as a baby, but at that age where I remember Cambodia, but I grew up here.
Right.
We identified ourselves as 1.5, i.e., the bridge generation. So for me, craft has to do with the language is in English, the aesthetic is in English, literary aesthetics, um, but the stories, the food practices, the religious and ethnic sort of identity, they're Cambodian. Uh, so it's very hybrid in that sense. That it's not purely one or the other. And I don't think it is a Khmer poem under the tamarind tree. It's because Khmer poetry, as I said in that essay, is very rigid in terms of the number of lines, in terms of the kind of rhyme patterns, and also this idea that poets that we have some sort of moral lesson to instill in our poetry. I grew up in Long Beach and educated and sort of read non-Khmer poetry and literature, that kind of thing. That's not the aesthetics that I learned.
Right.
Uh, so it has to do with being immigrants, immigrant writers and poets. It has to do with leaving, our homeland and then learning how to write here and etc. Um, and the audience is, I hope the audience is for Khmer Americans. You know, that's the sort of main audience, and then others who can read English. But the reason, like in Khmer, you have some words that are not translated,
Right.
and I wanted the Khmer American readers to know what those words are. Non-Khmer readers can get a sense of it based in context, and I try to do that. That would be wonderful, you know. But I wanted Khmer American readers to see themselves in that book. And Gon Khmer is translated to Child of Cambodia. Um, so it's very much you know, a book that has to do with being Khmer American, being Khmer American.
Right. Yeah. That's true. And let's talk about your novel a little bit. Gone Khmer. So this is a really, really interesting book, and it is very autobiographical. Um I wonder what you think about this genre of autofiction, um, and how you look at this book.
Yeah, I don't, the book has sort of gone through various changes. Um, I started the manuscript back in 2000 something. Um, it was all in the second point of view. It was very meta,
Oh,
and I was sort of bringing all kinds of sort of encyclopedia and dictionary and history text and everything else. It was very experimental. Back then, it was sort of trying to, because I was in grad school and theory was the thing, and meta text was sort of was what we all wanted to do, but it didn't work out. People weren't interested in it. It didn't have a narrative thread, um, at least like a parent one. Um, and then it kind of worked on it, changing the third person, and that didn't work either. So what you have here is, years of editing and revising, and you read Gruel, you see some of the themes and topics that are, revisited in Gon Khmer,
right.
um, and so on. And I call it autobiographical fiction. I knew that autofiction is very much a part of that, and it works in terms of autofiction. You have follows. It's a Bildungsroman that follows Samnang and his sort of emergence as a writer. So that works well in terms of autofiction. But I think what I did was I followed like the thread of my life in terms of the plot of moving from, uh, you know, leaving Cambodia and Thailand, and then growing up in the East Coast and California, and etc. So that's sort of very much my life, But there are details that I made up. The chapter Lokta that I mentioned earlier was made up. All of that.
Okay.
There's not, and I did that just because I wanted to show the contrast between Lokta or Cambodian world with the American world, and I wanted to show that those two are very difficult to reconcile. Uh, so that none of that happened in that chapter. There are a couple of other chapters that I also made up, and then there are chapters that actually happened that I think the Western readers might not think of it as actually happened. The very brief scene of Samnang seeing like a mermaid during a storm,
Hmm.
like
That's a beautiful, beautiful scene. I like that so much.
I that was true, but I don't know if the Western readers will see that as truthful. So there's stuff like that in terms of notions of truth and fiction
Right.
that I kind of just like throw it out there. And once, I can't call it nonfiction because once I made changes, it has to be something else. I can't, so there is stuff that I made in order to emphasize some themes and topics. And once I made that choice, because I believe that if you say something that is creative nonfiction, you have a contract with the readers and say all these things happen.
Right.
So I add, I change things to tighten the narrative to emphasize certain themes of of loss and conflict, and you so therefore, is autofiction or autobiographical novel, which is a word that I grew up, learning about, and etc. Um, but it's once you like even that that first night that Samnang and his family spent in Malden in America, like waking up in snow and stuff, and that's all made up, man. But it did happen, though. It must have happened in terms of, but to sort
Could
of make
happen,
it,
of course,
to
right?
make everything, compress everything into one night and one morning,
Yep.
that's fiction. That's
Yeah,
fiction.
exactly. Exactly. That's how fiction works, right?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I'm raising this question because I'm pretty skeptical of this whole idea of autofiction. Of course, there are some great writers, right,
Hmm.
who cherish it.
Right. Yeah. For me, like I said, as soon as I call it nonfiction, everything has to be true.
Right, nonfiction, obviously,
Yeah,
right?
but when you write and you know this, whether you select, you choose, you tweak, it's really, 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 in that sense, it's sort of you're reinventing and revising a reality and experience.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true. Yep. Um, Maybe this is my last question.
Hmm.
And it kind of relates to the first question we started with, this whole idea of ghost,
Hmm.
writing about those ghosts. Um, I was in Florida last week giving a reading at a library, and one of the audience members asked at the end. The question was, when do you think, in how many years, or what generation do you think, what generation of Nepalese do you think will write stories unrecognizable as written by a Nepali? So when will we, I don't know if we can interpret it that way, grow, right? Or just write about something that's about here, or we don't even have to know who the writer is, or maybe art for art's sake kind of thing. Just write a story for its own sake. So how would you answer that question? I'm curious.
Well, I mean, this is the question that's asked of Asian American writers too. It's the second, third, fourth generation. And I think whether you're Khmer American writers or whatever, you write what you want to write. Whatever the things that bother you, the things that haunt you, the things that matter to you. And if you want to write a poem about the flowers blooming in spring, that's fine. That's fine. Do that. You know, and But the thing that bothers us is because of our history and our culture and our racial identity and otherness in America. But I don't think we should be restricted to writing about our identity. I think we should write about whatever it is that we want to write about. But the things that matter to me and the things that I care about, they happen to be, you know, it has to do with my history and my identity. Now, I don't want like second or third or first generation Khmer American writers to write about being Khmer or the Cambodian genocide or this or that. I want them to have the freedom to choose whatever they want to write, as long as it matters to them. You know. So when does it happen? It could happen now. It could
Right,
happen 5 years from now, 3 generations from now.
right.
That's like a, there are Asian American writers who don't write about race, or
Definitely.
or they can sort of, but there's that connection, maybe much more subtle.
Right.
But I don't want to put pressure on us, glossing over the whole, because we're so different, all of us,
That's true.
different ways of experience and cultures and gender and etc. and sexuality. Write whatever you want to write, but I think if you write about the things that matter to you, I don't think you could escape culture and history and identity. You know?
Right.
That's just my response to that audience member. It's a good question, but
Right. Yeah, it's all about what matters,
you know,
right, to us, who we are, and what haunts me, right, as you
yeah,
said.
you know,
And the things that hunt us, my generation, won't hunt the next generation, of course, right? Things will
hmm
change, and
hmm
writing will also change. Writing changes with experiences, and the way we live our lives, right?
hmm
So it also reminds me of one of your poems, actually. I found it really interesting. So here
mm
you have this two-part poem, what we talk about when we talk about writing. The second
mm
part was
That's a
really,
long time ago.
yeah, but still, I found it so relevant, so interesting. Just the first part. You shouldn't write about women that way, she says. Hemingway is long dead. Besides, you are an Asian American. You should write about things that matter, like race, gender, class, power. So, yeah, I mean, um,
Yeah.
in some corners, we still see those things happening, or those expectations kind of working in a way.
Yeah. The real question is like, why are you writing about this and for whom?
Exactly.
Right? You know, and that's who is your audience and why you're writing it. If you're just writing about race just because that's what the marketing world wants you to write about, or that's not it. That's not it. You have to write about things that are important to you in a very authentic way because they move you. They're the reason why you took up writing in the first place. You know, so if you're going to write about race, but you don't really care about it, you just wanted to kind of make money off of, whatever the white world sort of sends of this is what an Asian person should write about, then that's not it. That's not the way for me, at least. It has to be authentic. It has to be real. It has to be genuine. If you read my work, you can get a sense that's who I am. That's what I write about. But I also the recent stuff now is sort of I write about my love for my kids. The shift from ghosts and the past to the present and the future. So
Exactly.
I've grown in terms of themes too, not just aesthetic, in terms of themes and topics. I write about my kids and their future.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely. I watched one of your videos, one of those readings. I think you read that poem for your son.
Yep,
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's how things change. That's how we write about our experiences.
absolutely.
So, any other issues, questions, ideas you'd like to share or ask before we leave?
No, I think we've covered a lot in terms of craft, in terms of being an immigrant writer, refugee writer, in terms of some of the images and themes such as ghost and hunger, and the inheritance of one's sort of history and past and culture. All those things are sort of they're you have these sort of themes that constellate in your sort of world, and that's what I've been doing. And I wish I have time in the world to write another novel, and this one is going to be different. I don't know when that'll be, but I wanted my sort of my occupation. I don't know about you, but my sort of central occupation it's always been what is that moment when we become American, when Asian become Asian American. I want to explore that further.
Yeah,
Golden
that's a
Khmer
very
is
interesting
sort of
topic.
a part of that narrative too. It's an American story, but it's a Khmer American story. I wanted to tell it again, but I wanted to tell it from a woman perspective. Because in Cambodian culture, you know, do you remember that chapter about the cousin who was beaten because she was a
Yeah,
woman? And
I do. Hmm.
that misogyny is very real. So I wanted to sort of look at it from the perspective of a woman. Like, when did she become a Khmer American woman instead of just a Khmer woman? So I just wish I have time. to work on that and work on poems and essays. But I don't think I would ever stop writing. Writing, I think it's just you know you're always thinking, you're always observing when there's experiences, and you wanted to process them. And when you process them, you get the result is an essay or a poem or a novel or this or that. I just wish I had more time. The kids are just taking up so much time. The grading too,
When they grow up,
the committee work, all that stuff. It's just like, but that's also good work too. To be a
it
parent,
is,
to be a teacher.
of course.
It's a privilege, it's an honor.
Yep.
So
Yeah, Dan, I'm pretty sure you'll write that novel very soon, and I
I
would.
don't know about that,
Maybe I'll be asking you some. Oh, how is it going?
but
Anyway, thank you so much once again. It
thank
was
you, Kim.
wonderful speaking with you. Thank you for sharing all these very insightful ideas and everything. And many
Thank
thanks
you.
to my audiences as well for watching this video. And I'll see you next time with my fourth episode. Um, Thank you so much. Bye bye.